Right. Well, welcome and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fifth event in the Swedish Chamber's digital discussion series, Emerging Stronger, where we discuss some of the biggest challenges facing businesses today. This series has now been running for, a year and a half, and was initially introduced in the ashes of the first fire of the pandemic, really. And whilst we in the UK, at least, were very much in our first lockdown still. At that point, we felt a strong need to focus on all the lessons and all the innovations and all the structural challenges and changes that the pandemic were offering us as a complement, I think, to all the negativity that was around us at the time. And today, luckily, things have moved on from the pandemic side of it. Well, moved into a different phase, I should say. In both Sweden and the UK, restrictions have been lifted, but obviously other challenges now await businesses out there. Sweden and the UK find themselves on two sides of the European Union. Trade wars are emerging, protectionism is on the rise. It sounds like a really gloomy picture, but there's light out there as well. But there's a real challenge, I think, to the status quo of trade affairs. Some argue that globalisation has peaked and that we're heading into a period of deglobalisation and regionalisation. But what does this mean for two of the strongest and most ardent free trade supporters, Sweden and the UK, but also what does it mean to Europe as a whole? And we're joined today by businesses across Europe as well. So this is what we're here to discuss today. And to our aid, we have an exciting lineup of speakers with lots of experience, and I think it's safe to say that they have their ears firmly to the ground in the political corridors. Welcome to David Cairns, former UK ambassador to Sweden and vice president for political and public affairs at Equinor UK, a Norwegian energy company. I almost said oil company, and David, I'm sure I shouldn't say that. Welcome to Mats Persson, partner at EY, and former Chief of Staff to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and former Special Advisor to the Prime Minister. And finally, James Sproul, Chief Economist at Handelsbanken UK. We also hope that, I should make this one, we also hope that you at home take the opportunity to get involved and ask questions using the Q&A function. These sessions work really well when you, the participants and audience, get involved, and make sure to get those questions in early. We find that we get a lot of questions in the last 7 minutes and struggle to fit them in, so get them in. A huge thank you from our side at the Swedish Chamber of Commerce for the UK to our series sponsor Handelsbanken and to Thinking the Unthinkable. And thank you also, as I pointed out, to Swedish Chambers International and the many chambers in different markets joining us today. And now, to not take up too much of your time, please welcome our host, Nick Gowing, director and founder of Thinking the Unthinkable and former BBC World News anchor, amongst many other things, Nick. Nick has joined us since day one of the Emerging Stronger series and is a very dear friend to the Swedish business community here in London. We're very excited to be working with you again, Nick. Thank you, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And let me just emphasize, please get those questions in or those thoughts coming in as soon as possible. I can see them on the grid. Don't leave it to the end, as Peter said, the last 7 minutes, otherwise it gets so back-end loaded. And you can help set the agenda. There's no greater agenda that we've agreed and fixed and rigged in advance. It's about engaging with you and hearing what is on your minds as well. And I think having introduced each of the three panelists, what I'd like to do is next ask each of you what your definition of protectionism is. So let me first of all go to David. Do you have a clear idea of what protectionism is? Because we need to be clear what we're talking about, and I'll ask each of the three of you.
Yes, morning, Nick, and morning, Peter. And it's great to be back at the Swedish Chamber. I mean, the Swedish Chamber in London is really one of the best chambers of commerce in the UK. So it's very nice to be back and see some friendly faces. Just to take the question a bit wider, if I may, Nick. I mean, well, we talked. Peter introduced this a lot about returning, bouncing back from COVID and then building back better. And of course, that has been relevant in some countries in the world in the last year. But I actually think we need to look, beyond that chronologically and back to, the impacts of the financial crisis of 2008 and the questions about the wider particularly Anglo-Saxon model of the economy, where this year you've got 3 billionaires blasting into space, but the Sutton Trust in the UK is giving out 2.5 million food parcels for the homeless, and that's a division between the rich and the poor in some of our economies. But the other side of protectionism is, if you say the words emerging stronger in China, you're thinking about something completely different. If you use the words building back better, you're talking about repairs of schools from earthquakes in Sichuan. And I think if you're sitting in the Asian part of the world, we're coming to the era of, ever more so the era of China, the emergence or re-emergence of China as it sees it's in its right place in the world as the world's leading economy. And what does that mean for America as the world's leading power, and the rise in protectionism in the elements of that, and in particular in the way that China has been doing that, both not just economically, which is always going to be a threat, but also politically. So what it's done domestically, what it's doing in Hong Kong against democracy, expansion of its powers in the South China Sea, it's all encouraged sort of a protectionist rise against that part of the world as well. So I think two different things here going on, slightly different angles from Peter's only about building back from COVID.
All right, thanks, David. Matt, what if you were still in number 10, or what do you think of in EY about protectionism? Is there a danger of the word protectionism being used too liberally? Do you have a clarity in your mind as to what it means?
I wouldn't say 100% clarity. I can try, but I agree with you. I think defining protectionism in kind of a practically meaningful way, I think, is important, because it becomes sort of one of those things that people sort of use and has quite negative connotations, and I understand why. What I will say is, traditionally, a little bit to what David was talking about, right? Traditionally, I think protectionism has been defined more or less as protecting domestic industry via border taxes, right? I mean, that's a fairly simple standard view of protectionism, which is permeating through academic literature. I think what is happening now is that protectionism is become a slightly more complicated phenomenon. And what I will say is it's domestic, it's protection of domestic things, but that can be sort of industry, that can be economic activity, clearly jobs, but it can also be sort of, a perceived way of life and protecting democratic institutions or democratic constitutional orders, right? We saw a stark example of that in Brexit. So it has moved beyond an economic, I think, proposition into something which is more political, social, cultural. And secondly, if you want to define protectionism in 2021, I think you need to move beyond goods. So it's not only, to my previous point, the protectionism of goods moving across borders. It's protectionism is protecting sort of protectionism relative to people, clearly, as I mentioned, job markets. It's protectionism around the provision of services, but also crucially protectionism around the movement of data. Data is a huge asset, or technology. That's one of the big things between China and the US. So more intangible things that aren't necessarily physical. And then crucially, of course, with the rise of e-commerce and all of that, right, which you have seen accelerated via, through the pandemic, there's a blurring of the line between trading goods and services and data. I mean, that's sort of coming together. So it is protectionism in the traditional sense of the word, that you protect something domestic, but it has broadened in terms of both its objectives and what is trying to be protected. And that is done for various different objectives, which we can talk about what's sort of driving that protectionism. But definition to me is one which is broader now than traditionally might have been the case.
Much broader then. Thanks, Matt. James.
Yes, thanks. Very, very good to be with all of you today. I think protectionism is really, to my mind, it's about a fear of change. And that fear of change and nations, the politicians in those nations, protecting the portion of their population who fear that change the most. And I'm reminded that a few years ago, before all of our minds got completely focused on COVID all the time, there was a chart doing the rounds that everybody looked at, which was known as the elephant chart, which essentially showed that looking at global wealth, and it showed that the very, very poorest in the world remained very poor, but that a mass of people had become far better off than they'd ever been historically, through really all the aeons of time. And then it dipped down, and it was the relatively low-skilled or semi-skilled people in developed economies who were losing out. And then, of course, the trunk went up, and the top 10%, whatever you want to call it, did very, very well indeed as well. And it was the need or the desire to of developed economy politicians to protect those people, I think that's led to a lot of this sort of backlash against it. I think what's also really interesting right now is that globalization is changing immensely, and globalization, in my mind, at least initially, was largely about taking cost advantage. So we would move production from Europe or America to, say, for instance, parts of Asia, and that benefited those Asians, and it also benefited many people in developed economies. But of course, it didn't benefit garment workers in developed economies. They were the losers, and there's been a need to compensate them or protect them as things have gone on, because people do get scared. I think actually that the next phase of globalization is not going to be about further movement of that stuff. I think it's largely happened. I think it's going to be about the exchange of ideas, and therefore Mats's comment on about data, I think, is really, really important, because it will be largely driven by the fact that the people are able to communicate with each other much more effectively than they ever were before, through social media, through the various things like we're doing right now. That just wasn't available half a generation ago. And therefore, the collaboration with people is going to be an absolute hallmark of where value is added and where countries and societies do well or not. And we're going to see a big shakeout of that over the next, I would say, 10 to 20 years.
Okay, James, we've already got a first thought, a challenge from Julian Henwood to all of you about your view of what the biggest driver is behind global protectionism. Is it the traditional clash, economic, political, religious ideologies, or is it now more a 21st century land grab for the ownership of new technologies, energy sources, and natural resources? I've actually consulted Mr. Google on this, just if it helps. Protectionism refers to government policies that restrict international trade to help domestic industries. Protectionist policies are usually implemented with the goal to improve economic activity within a domestic economy. I put that on the agenda because it seems to me to very much get to the heart of what we're debating here about the rise of protectionism and its challenge to globalization, the inward-facing side of this. All three of you, David first, what is your view about how this is internalizing a lot of the challenges with a nationalism, a nationalistic pitch? And that idea as well, we just heard from Julian Henwood about what the biggest drive is behind global protectionism. David.
Yeah, thanks. So just to pick up something that James said, slightly disagree with it about the sort of fear of change. So I'm not sure if it is all around the fear of change. I know you've had previous sessions looking at technology and actually an excitement of change, and I can only see it through the vision of my children, who want more change quicker on IT things and flying drones and what have you. They want less of it. I think the fear of change is not really that. It's more about fear of loss. I think if you're especially in a rich, especially Western democracy, where you are essentially at the top of the economic world tree, you feel that you might be going down the other side of that. I think it's fear of that and fear of loss that's driving stuff. And therefore, on this sort of nationalism,
are you experiencing protectionism within your family then?
No, I have optimism with my family, but I see protectionism, for example, in our business, where we have, for example, a very big offshore wind business in the UK, and the UK, as we've talked about, is generally a home of a beacon of open economy, but it is moving towards a situation where they want to introduce local content requirements for future projects.
And would you call that protectionist?
That's common. In traditional UK terms, that's very protectionist. Mm-hmm. It's more common elsewhere, but that isn't moved by the UK government in that looking after local jobs and looking after local workers in a more active, determined way than would have been the case, say, 20 years ago, where there was an assumption that investment would trickle down into jobs employment, and that didn't happen.
Matt,
I think it did.
Sorry, James, come back.
I think if you look at the UK has many economic problems. I don't think employment market is particularly one of them. I take the point about Peter's point about it being fear of loss. I think fear of change is. I think we're really driving at the same thing. But I do think that the investment in the UK has certainly driven a lot of employment in the last 20 years. And you look at unemployment right now. The peak unemployment in the early 1980s was 12%. The peak unemployment this time is arguably going to have been about 5.2%. So that's much more employment. Now, there's lots of questions about, are those jobs sufficiently well paid? Are they sufficiently secure? But there are jobs.
But is it, just quickly, James, is it a result of a protectionist instinct now that has been achieved? Which is
no, I think it's the opposite. I think it's the result of a very open economy. And I think that as with so many economic changes, you make a policy decision or policy change, and only very slowly over time do the full impact of that policy change get felt. I mean, I would argue that we had a great liberalization of the labour market in the UK over the 1980s, and it really wasn't seen for about 15 to 20 years afterwards, the full benefits. And we've seen it now. I mean, if we've seen unemployment peak at, say, well under 6%, that's half the level it was in the early 1980s. That's progress. That's really good stuff.
Mats.
So yeah, so Nick, by the way, I did Google as well before I joined the call, and I saw the same definition.
We both agree on the Google definition.
Yeah, no, I anticipate that someone pulled it up, and therefore I started with that in my definition, and I broadened it. You know, I'm disappointed you didn't notice that, but there we are. What I would say is, first of all, I would say something. The question is, what is the driver of protectionism, right? That's the question we're at. Nick, is that correct?
Yes.
So I will say a couple of things here. So one is, I'm not sure. I will challenge two simplifications. One is that globalization has peaked, or not necessarily simplification, but I would challenge two propositions. So the first one is that globalization has peaked, and that we are globally and cumulatively particularly protectionist now compared to previous points in history. I'm not sure that is true. It depends on what data you're looking at. I think what's interesting about this point in time is that you have examples of trade disintegration and so forth, coexisting with other expressions of continued globalization, and even arguably accelerating globalization. For example, if you look at technology consumption, the TikTok phenomenon. I mean, all of these are expressions of globalization. Equally, there are more free trade agreements in force today than at any point in history. And to the extent we believe that free trade agreements is an expression of free trade, there's a big, vibrant debate between liberals and libertarians on that point. I happen to think that free trade agreements are an expression of free trade. If we accept that, then clearly, there are many areas and many different sectors and markets where you see trade integration and globalization in various shapes and forms continuing. So it's not necessarily true. It's too simplistic to say that globalization has peaked or is reversing. I think it depends on where we look. I think the second thing I would say is the second thing I would challenge here, which I think both James and David were alluded to in different ways, was this idea that it's like a populist reductionist response to economic complicated consequences from different policies. And I'm not necessarily sure that's always the case, and this is why I want to try to answer the question. So I think today there are, to the extent we accept the definition of protectionism that we sort of landed at, I think there are 5 drivers of protectionism, right? Protectionist type policies. So driver number 1 is, which what Julian was talking about, is basically system clashes, right? Where you have just inherent competing global interests, and obviously the US and China, that's a systemic trade conflict. That's clash of two economic models. The second big driver, I think, is sort of what you can broadly describe as control, trying to regain control. That can be democratic control I mentioned earlier, but it can also be things like control of strategic supply chains. So one of the things that countries are now trying to do in wake of COVID is to have domestic production of PPE, for example, so they don't rely on global supply chains, that they have that domestically, which is a fully legitimate health response, right? Which doesn't really have anything to do with jobs or protectionism, as we would understand, just a sort of a public health response. So it's control, both democratic but for other objectives. Then the third driver, I think, is around, we talked about labor market already. So that's about making sure that you have a labor market which isn't subject to imbalances on fair practices, etc. We saw that with end of free movement. The fourth driver, I think, is restoring economic imbalances. In the UK, that is known as leveling up. And then the fifth driver, and again, this would challenge the notion that this is populist, is net zero. It's the drive to net zero, which is emerging as a very big driver of what we might call protectionism. Think about the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is pushing, the CBAM. that is a strongly protectionist measure, but it's done to reach net zero, and it's done because the perceived, probably rightly, conclusion has been drawn that you cannot have a domestic single market and a certain price of carbon without some sort of protectionism around it that sort of adjusts or abates the delta between the price of carbon in that market and the price of carbon globally. That is a very protectionist measure, but I think we all probably agree that is sort of flows naturally from net zero. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to say that these 5 drivers are complex to interact, and it's difficult to see which one is the biggest. But if you want to understand protectionist responses, I think it's really important that we dig into each and every one of them, and do not sort of give reductionist answers around a blanket objection to protectionism.
All right, well, to give you an idea of what's being thought about around chambers in Europe, here are a couple of anonymous contributions. Good morning. Do you think the current labour shortage in the UK will potentially change protectionist views? And secondly, if you were an international business expanding into the global markets today, would you feel differently today than you would have, say, 20 years ago? And how would you assess your expansion today? Bear those in mind that I ask you, is there a danger of protectionism being confused by greater nationalism? Are the two complementary to each other? Is there a new tension emerging there? I've just put that onto the agenda. David.
Gosh, all right, 3 questions in there, and just to pick up what Max was saying, I agree with a lot of what he says. On the sort of globalization, I wouldn't say that the number of trade deals is necessarily a sign of more globalization, because if you go back to Bhagwati's spaghetti bowl of trade deals, one of the failures of globalization was the multilateral Doha round, and actually you'd have had less deals, but you might have had more globalization. I completely agree that actually in many ways the world's on to more globalization, not less, by many measures. Just to take labor in the UK, and I think part of this actually is going into COVID was very bumpy, and coming out of COVID is also bumpy, and probably bumpier than people expected. And trying to get back to increased demand is quite hard, and a lot of things and people are in the right place. And the other element too that's shown up through COVID is just how sort of lean so many supply chains are. I think Matt and James touched on this already, but you talk about fine margin as a percentage for things running smoothly and things coming to a gridlock. And we've seen that. We saw that in flour, flour on the shelves or toilet rolls on the shelves last spring, and you're seeing it in truck drivers now. So one thing looking ahead will be interesting to see what UK and others do by way of encouraging more margins in supply chains, so that there's less risk of things grinding to a halt at a very short notice. And then on sort of international expansion, I think it probably depends where you are. So if you are looking at working in China today, you're probably going to be a lot more careful about that than you would have been 10 years ago, because the whole political relationship between China and here and the United States has changed, and it is more risky of things going wrong and impacting you elsewhere than it would have been a decade ago. Let me stop there.
James, again, that question of protectionism and nationalism, is there a danger of confusing the two when you look at the PRC, China, and those other questions which I put to you about expanding into the global markets and also the UK labour market at the moment? What are you saying to Handelsblatt?
Well, I think that actually the reason, of course, there's a danger of confusing the two is there's a large overlap between the two. I think there is a lot of there's more nationalism around, and oftentimes it does reflect itself in protectionism. I don't think there's complete coincidence, but I think there's enough overlap, as I say, to mean that there's actually validity to that. So I think that there's an element of that. I want to pick up also on Matt's net zero point, because I think it's a very good one. But as far as the UK labour market goes, I think Peter is absolutely right in terms of looking at coming out of COVID in what I called 2 big effects of inflation right now. One is the base effect, measuring today's prices against those of a year ago. The second is the friction, and people's habits have changed over the course of COVID, and business needs to adjust to that. And that adjustment period, is the friction we're seeing, is largely being felt in the labour market. Now, there are some issues, of course, about or as many people coming back into the UK that may have gone back home to large part to Eastern Europe, are they going to come back to the UK? Many will have permission to, but will they want to come back? That's yet to be seen, and certainly we're seeing labour shortages. The market's working pretty well here, I would think. What's the most likely way to tempt people to come back if they've got permission to come back to the UK? Well, it'd be good wages. And given that wage prices are, we've had 2 months of above 8%, and we've got apocryphal stories of lorry drivers getting 30% pay increase as well. That's going to tempt people back into the industry. So I think that yes, we have clearly a labour market shortage, but at the same time, we've got the solution, which is already in action. On the global expansion, I think, along with the geography, it really also depends upon the industry. And I think that one of the changes I'm seeing in globalization is the way in which information exchange and the number of people able to participate in an industry is so spectacularly large that figuring out how to coalesce all of those inputs is a huge challenge, but an enormously rewarding one for the businesses that get it right. And therefore, I think that's how globalization is going to change. You can put sand in the wheels of actual movement of goods. It's more difficult to put stoppages to a lot of service industries where it's exchange of ideas, exchange of people. And finally, just look at that net zero. I absolutely agree with Matt that is one of the drivers, or a potential driver, of protectionism. And I'm concerned there because both net zero is obviously a highly desirable policy, but at the same time, it becomes unarguable. So people can use this as a cloak. Those who don't want to have globalization can use the net zero as a way to back away from trade and back away from exposing their domestic markets to competition, and that will be ultimately bad. But it's a difficult policy to argue against if you end up saying I'm against net zero. I'm not against net zero. I'm against the protectionism that's cloaking itself up using net zero. But that's a different factor.
So just before you go to Matt, it is a challenge to the globalization of solutions to save this planet in crude terms.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All right, Matt.
Yeah, just I with the risk of everyone agreeing with each other, which is quite boring for a discussion like this. But this last point that James mentioned, I totally agree with that.
Consensus helps understand and drives a better understanding, if I may put it that way, Matt. That
is a good way of looking at it, Nick, and we're also the Swedish Chamber of Commerce that we're talking about here, and without consensus, so that's also good. But I totally agree. I think there is a real risk thinking about emerging stronger, which is the theme here, right? Like in terms of emerging stronger, I think there is a real risk that, net zero, for example, becomes a protectionist Christmas tree that everyone hangs measures on in order to achieve other objectives. And that is a real danger. We will not emerge stronger if that is what net zero becomes. It needs to be a combination of various factors, like a carbon border tax will not help Europe to catch up with Asia on innovation R&D around the battery economy, for example. It won't. The only thing it will do is it will drive up price. So that cannot alone be sort of a net zero policy. In itself, it doesn't do anything. It needs to be combined with a number of other policies that aren't protectionist, that are innovation and growth enhancing. So anyway, that's sort of just to say I agree with that. So Nick, so it was a question about the UK labour market, particularly sort of
Do you think the current labour shortage in the UK will potentially change protectionist views or not?
So it depends. So I think the thing about this lorry driver situation, right? As the saying goes, the lorry driver is for life, not only for Christmas. And if you sort of saw the comments from certain UK politicians, you see in the UK context how strongly held this overriding political, and I guess you could call it an economic objective to try to pay domestic workers more. How strongly held that is, right? Even in the face of shortages at the petrol pumps, there's still the compromise is 3-month visas for 5,000 lorry drivers, right? That's how strong that overriding political objective is. So I don't think that will change in the UK. I think that will remain. Brexit was a vote against free movement and for democratic control. It was not a vote against free trade, I think, personally. So therefore, in the UK context, I don't think the labour shortage will change, at least in the short term, the government's policy on this. In Europe, of course, they have, so if you look at Olaf Scholz and others, that, you know, it's easy to sit in the EU27 and draw the conclusion that we don't have this problem in the EU27 because we have a larger market and we can compensate for peaks and troughs and demand and supply in a much more efficient way through deployment of human capital because of a larger market. So I think in the EU27 this might be perceived as a reminder of why you need to have large markets and the single market is working. So I think, as so often, the EU27 and the UK may draw sort of diametrically opposite conclusions, or at least policy responses to the UK labour shortage. There was a question around growth. You know, if you advise,
if you were an international business expanding into global markets today, or trying to, would you feel differently than you would have done, say, 20 years ago?
So I spend a lot of, in my current role, I spend a lot of time advising firms on this very question, particularly on sort of growth strategies. Where do you go if you're going to set up shop, if you're going to target new customers? And are you
impressed by their grip on what you're talking about?
I am
always
mixed bag. No, what I will say is
tell us a bit more if you can. You know, a mixed bag, you say. Is there a degree of naivete out there?
Yeah, no, but look, I think what I will say is big business in particular, I should be careful what I say here, but what clearly is the case is that what we might call sort of geopolitical concerns, political concerns, I'm sure David can speak to this as well, right, in his current role, that has sailed up the agenda as a very important consideration when you're trying to establish yourself somewhere, when you're trying to enter into a market. I think much more so than perhaps a few years ago, you know, if you think about perhaps 2014, 2015, where, you know, if you were going to go to China, of course, that was a consideration. If you're going to go sort of a Chinese business going to the US or a European business going to China, etc., that feature, but wasn't really overriding. So I think this idea, you know, the 5 objectives, the 5 drivers of protectionism that I mentioned earlier, that is now top of mind of CEOs, right, to much greater degree than before. So perhaps in the past, perhaps you would have a financial modeler advising you, or, you know, someone looking at the EBITDA, or, you know, building a plant as cost efficient as possible. Now you have geostrategic strategists helping as well. So that definitely has come as a sort of an increased importance in doing, for example, location analysis. So that definitely exists there. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have this, you know, this localization of business everywhere. I think, as James said, it depends very much on the sector. And I will say, just very briefly, I will say there are 3 different categories of business here, right? So category 1 would be, I think, sort of global business that are just still functioning largely and make a decision largely based on global market dynamics. Retail and consumer products mostly fall into that category. I think there are very few retailers that have moved out of China, for example, actually. The second category of business, I would think almost like semi-strategic, I would say, where it's sort of, there is kind of a strategic element to them. But, you know, if you're the UK or if you're a European country, you're probably confident to have that industry based in either your own country or amongst allies, you know. So provision of nuclear would be an example of that, for example. And then the third category would be like hyper-strategic, where, you know, for example, on essential technologies, talk a lot about the 5G net, etc. That's where it's now turning into be completely domestic. So depending on which category you fall in there as a business, you can either have a lot of problem trying to establish yourself in a far-flung part of the world, or it can just functioning according to global market dynamics as before. So it depends on very much which sector you fall into. But if you want to establish a business somewhere, and if you're insecure about it, do get in touch. Give me a call, and I will help you.
All right, but we've got other questions coming in, and please, none of you are breaking cover apart from Julian Henwood right at the beginning. I'd love to know who's actually sending the messages. So if you'd like to put your name, it would be helpful rather than just another anonymous. But let me just, if I can, pursue that one question about thinking the current labour shortage in the UK will potentially change protectionist views. I need to ask each of you, because, well, I can see what you're saying. You don't need to answer anymore, James, because you're shaking your head. But both James and Matt's worked as political appointees within Number 10. David, you worked as a public servant and ambassador until very recently. How would you be describing the UK position here? Because there are many out there who are saying the protectionism, which is making sure we only, say, invite 5,000 truckers to come here until Christmas Eve is actually bonkers when you've got 100,000 shortage. In other words, upholding a principle of protectionism carries economic negatives. I'm putting that to you. David, if you were having to defend that policy now sitting in Stockholm, what would you be saying?
I think the whole issue of immigration to and emigration from the UK is widely misunderstood.
By
so
whom?
If you go back by everybody in terms of the numbers. So if you go back historically, you have around a movement of many hundreds of thousands, maybe 500,000 in each direction each year. The people leaving the UK and people coming into the UK. And of course, Matt said, Brexit was lost about taking control of people coming into the UK. But that was on the back of a boom of, particularly from Poland, but from Eastern Europe, coming to the UK after 2004, where these large numbers impacted small communities in a big way, and local people didn't really like it. Coming up to 10 years on from that opening, the UK is in a different place. And so you have this daily disconnect here with some, strident criticism of refugees coming into Kent over this summer and saying send them back, very, very tough policies, and on the very same day quietly welcoming over 70,000 people from Hong Kong
and Afghanistan.
So I don't think the overall picture is grasped, and I think that the politics is very fluid on it, and so the overall narrative, I can't see this government changing its position on being tough on movement of people from the EU, because that's what they were elected to. But I think over time the UK sort of politic, as it were, will become more flexible on the subject.
All right, James, you were shaking your head vigorously. Quickly, why are you rejecting that?
Well, first of all, I think that David's point is extremely well made about the Hong Kong people coming in. I don't think it's spurring any objections to that at all. And I think that there was a moment in time when people were particularly irritated about it, and that moment was when we had, obviously, the Brexit referendum. No, I was shaking my head because, from the government's point of view, seeing wages of low-paid people go up is a good thing. It may not be good for the economy as a whole. It may not be good for people at the top end of the earnings scale. But if you are looking at defending red wall seats, as the government is doing, and looking at leveling up, this sounds like music to your ears.
Is it impacting globalisation, though, James?
It will be impacting inflation in the UK, and there will need to be an adjustment mechanism for that, and it will be impacting the UK economy much more than globalisation. But it certainly will have an economic impact in the UK, and the government, I think, is willing to pay that price at least until it becomes inflationary and the Bank of England responds, and then they wonder where it all went wrong. But for the moment, they're probably enjoying it.
That's interesting. Paying the price and wondering where it all went wrong. You're suggesting that even if they feel it's the right policy, it is not going to be the best policy in the longer term, however much longer is.
I mean, my view of it would be it does usher in an inflationary element, and if the Bank of England responds to that, we don't have to put up interest rates very much before the government's own cost of borrowing starts to go up, and we see lots of consumers who are heavily extended on mortgages also feeling the pinch, and you see the economy slow pretty quickly as a result. But Matt, that's not happened yet.
Okay, Matt, so I'm trying to keep to protectionism and globalization, which is the question we're addressing here. But just coming back to what you would be saying if you were still in government about, even if there's a political imperative, the economic imperative and other realistic imperatives about keeping an economy going. And I'm still driven by that question about the labor shortage in the UK, 1 million vacancies at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm trying to think about what level to put sort of an analysis on here a little bit, but
well, we'll give it the simplest, sharpest 30-second analysis.
Yeah, that's you picked the exactly right question to give that simple 30-second answer. I think we all have a few scars on this debate as well, right? To show for it. But what I would say is
because of misjudgment.
What I think is, so I would say two things. One is, I sort of agree with James, right? Like this is very strongly held. I come back to my previous point about the overriding objective. I guess the economic argument here would be that the labor market has for too long, the UK labor market has been for too long been, I guess, what you can crudely describe as artificially reliant on cheap labor from Europe, and that has exacerbated these economic imbalances. So from the economic argument here would be, notwithstanding inflation, which I'm deeply nervous about in general, I lose sleep over inflation, but that's nothing new. So leave aside economic sort of inflationary pressures here. The economic argument from a UK government's point of view is that the shortage is temporary. You know, eventually here, sort of in the medium term, things will correct and you will have a more balanced labor market, which is economically good, because the more economically balanced economy and labor market produces greater overall growth. So it takes 9 months to train up.
Do you reckon that's a correct calculation, or based on?
I think there are elements of it which is correct. It takes 9 months to train up a lorry driver. You know, some of the shortages have to be addressed anyway. It's not sustainable that some parts of the economy is so heavily dependent on labor from elsewhere. There's also an element, you know, as we know, there are pockets of the population in the UK, the working age population, which is outside the labor market, has very poor paid, you know, or insecure jobs, and I don't think that is healthy in the long term. So I think this element of that is correct. I would argue that the UK government's taken it too far in that kind of balancing act. So in this particular instance, I think they've taken it too far. I mean, it's a sliding scale. So, you know, they've taken it too far to one end, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the full economic analysis, nor necessarily the political objective behind it is illegitimate, because that is not necessarily the case. The final point I would make, Nick, and this is really important and sort of a challenge back to the EU27 on this, which is, you know, you talk about globalisation and protectionism putting a wall around your labour market. Where do you draw the line? You have to draw a line somewhere. The UK has drawn the line, put this border, put this kind of protection, if you will, in this instance, around the UK, but the EU27 is putting around the EU27. Why there? Why not make it global? If you take the argument around a larger market, the more efficient use of human capital, then you should the market is infinite. So why has the EU27 chosen free movement within, but a quite protectionist border around the EU27? So, you know, yes, the UK has you know, got the balance slightly wrong here, I think, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the EU27 isn't protectionist. It's just that it's put its border somewhere else.
But we're also seeing protectionist instincts in many EU countries over the Green Deal. But look,
yeah,
we've got 15 minutes to run. We've got several questions still I'd like to get through. Let me and so if you can keep your answers reasonably short, please. Not that you've been long up to now, but it would be great to get even more questions in. This from Susanna Silversol from the Swedish Embassy. In light of Matt's 5 drivers of protectionist type policies, what key UK government initiatives and policies are most crucial in the coming months to look out for, especially, for example, the levelling up white paper and the net zero strategy? Have you answered some of that already, do you think, Matt? But is there anything more you want to add quickly before I go to James and David on that?
I can just take net zero, and then you know, the others maybe can look at levelling up. But I think yes, I've answered it. I think actually in the net zero context, the price of carbon and the carbon border mechanism is absolutely essential. I think these are two really sort of key driver with respect to net zero. Some of that is fitting within this debate around protectionism. We talk about border taxes, and some of it probably slightly outside of it. But those would be the main issues. And then I think it's interesting to see how the free trade agreements will play out on this, particularly sort of the TCA, which has, for those of you who follow this, which has really interesting rules of origin in it around, for example, batteries. How will that what will the impact on that be, and how will the EU and the UK actually treat that once it sort of plays out in an exporting, importing type environment?
Okay. Around
batteries, large scale battery production in EVs.
David, James, do you want to add anything? Because there are other questions I can go to. David, James?
Yeah, just quickly, we talked about on net zero. I think this is one of the great opportunities for globalization. So you see today, like a Danish company, Ørsted, has just announced business in Japan. Other European companies such as us or Vattenfall are really expanding their opportunities in Asia and elsewhere as sort of the net zero technologies and zero carbon opportunities come through. So I think that's great. And I would say that CBAM is going to be a bad spanner in that works if it comes through. Stop there.
James, anything to add quickly?
Just very quickly, I think it's the key is where do we look for ideas, which is really comes back to Matt's thing about the trade agreements. If things are going well, and I hope and trust that they will, it will be a very outward-looking government, and it will promote that outward-looking aspect from business. The worst possible thing would be looking for national champions and looking entirely inward for all the solutions to the challenges that we face. I don't think we'll find the solutions if we do that.
Thanks, Susanna. I hope that gives you a clarity there. Now, here's something of a bombshell to many. Anonymous, I have to say. Do you think protectionism would help in the long run if we don't implement pro-growth reforms? In other words, on protectionism, we haven't seen anything yet. David?
No.
Okay. No to what?
No, I don't think long-term protectionism is the answer to the problem, is my short
But is there a danger, when you think of some of the places you've served, is there a danger that some countries are going to resort to it because they see it as the most effective way forward to protect their economy?
I don't think they've resorted to it. I think they've held it for a long time, and there is a traditional, we might call it an Asian model of protected growth, which has worked for some and not for others, and perhaps it hasn't worked for those who've implemented it as well as they might wish.
Matt, what do you think? Do you think protectionism would help in the long run if we don't implement pro-growth reforms? I mean, it is quite a bombshell, potentially, not least saying if we don't implement pro-growth reforms in this new climate emergency net zero environment. And there's an additional one, which may have come from the same person. It has that same ring about it. Do you think protectionist will actually make it that, I'll start again. Do you think protectionist will actually make it take longer for the economy to adjust? Matt?
So definitions here, right? What do we mean by pro-growth reforms? But I think broadly speaking, I agree that, a little bit what I said earlier around the border taxes. If that is not, you kind of need to start with a policy which actively encourages and incentivizes and boosts things like innovation and productivity. You don't start with your border tax, because if you do, you don't. There's no domestic productivity or job creation benefit in and of itself from protecting your market. That has to come from elsewhere. So I think it's, yes, as a frame, as a headline, you absolutely need pro-growth policies. You need, you need to make a market. You need to facilitate certain industries via making it as easy as possible to do business, in my view.
This question that Matt is about, what if it doesn't work? Well,
if it doesn't work, I mean, this is the risk, right? I mean, protectionism versus sort of liberal markets is always a bit of a pendulum. That's why I never sort of, I don't believe this is one-way street. It always goes back and forth a bit. But yes, I totally agree. If, of course, we know that there's a direct correlation between when things get worse, when things get bad, politicians have a tendency to reach for protection instincts. So I think, it definitely has the potential to get worse. It has the potential to get worse here in the UK. It has the potential to get worse in the EU 27, definitely. In the US, Biden is not, this champion of free trade after Trump that some people in Europe had thought. So, and as David said, in some countries in Asia already very heavy tariff-led protectionism. Actually, think about India, for example. So yes, it has really a lot of potential to get worse, and that's why it's good that we have this debate.
And there are many governments who are actively campaigning in the normal election cycle to be more protectionist because they feel it gets more support for them electorally. James, quickly, you're both nodding there. But just picking up that point about if we don't implement pro-growth reforms, more protectionism will be the result.
My fear is that the EU in particular thinks that it has put forward a number of pro-growth reforms over the last number of years. I remember what came out of Lisbon a number of years ago, and they haven't really resulted in the degree of entrepreneurialism taking off in large parts of Europe that one would hope. And therefore, the conclusion would be that we've not we tried that, it didn't work, therefore we need to go for protectionism. That is one thing that worries me. I don't necessarily think it's the default position, but it's certainly a plausible enough explanation for some people that they will grasp hold of that. And I think that the way that the world is changing and the number of people able to participate in an economy means that you do absolutely need to have really entrepreneurial and pushing for that pro-growth. But it's invariably not a government-led pro-growth. And that's going to be a real challenge for some people in the EU who will look to the government to be giving them guidance. And I don't think this is something the government can guide you out of. I think it's much more going to be the private sector developing, and it's going to be much more chaotic than some people are going to be comfortable with. But that doesn't mean it's not.
All three of you just think about this. Is this really potentially putting the European project at risk increasingly because of protectionism and the way things are developing? I'll come back to that in a moment. Can I just go to a couple of other questions, again from Mr. and Mrs. Anonymous? They're both connected, but not directly. The panel's view on what or could change the US-China relationship and diffuse it, particularly when it comes to the Trumpian instinct of protectionism and also the Chinese instinct as well. And secondly, how will a new German leadership impact Europe in relation to protectionism and trade? Pick what you want out of that, whether it be US-China or certainly whenever we get a government and a clarity from Berlin, what impact that will have on protectionism. David?
Maybe I'll take the first one and then let others do the second one. So in the US-China relationships, I mean, I think we're just in the long haul for this, because it is a seismic change in world power, where China is on the way to becoming the world's #1 economy, and is going to assert its power and rights as that. And for the United States, that is seismic. So I don't think it's going to go away. I mean, to diffuse it along the way needs a lot of work, a lot of behind the scenes, diplomacy, and not accidentally walking into mistakes that then cause bigger problems. But I can't see that trajectory changing of friction just because we are a tipping point of the balance of power in the world.
And where does Germany, the new German government for the next 4 years, assuming it is there for the 4 years, where does Germany fit into this quickly?
So my sense of Germany is that its lesson from Afghanistan might be less engagement rather than more, I'm afraid.
All right, James, those two questions, particularly US, China, and Germany.
I actually think that I don't agree with David on this. I don't think China is headed for #1. I think it's the challenge for China has long been to get rich before they get old. I think they get old before they get rich. And that will be the longer term determinant of economic success is going to be the degree of innovation. And I don't think the Chinese are really going to be as good about that as they might hope. But that will certainly lead to a lot of friction, because they certainly see themselves as deserving of being #1, even if they don't actually achieve it. I also think that within the US, there's obviously a huge amount of disagreement between Republicans and Democrats. One of the few areas of agreement on policy is standing up to China. So I think that you will find more unification on that than you will find in many other places. So I think that China certainly will remain a big issue, but I don't think the US is going to lose its spot as the world's biggest economy. On Germany, I think that one of the things about Merkel and her very, very long period in government is that she knew the European Union extraordinarily well, and she knew where, in the political phrase, where all the bodies were buried, and therefore she could get things done. The new leader of Germany will clearly not have that degree of control, and they will need to be focused a lot more on domestic issues. And I think that's probably going to be good for Germany. But I do think it means that Germans, and I agree with David, they're going to become much more domestically focused for the foreseeable future. And that's probably what the German people want.
All right. Mats, I hope you're still with me. Yes, I can see you. David, I'm not sure if you've slipped away. Do you mind, we've got 3 minutes left, if I just jump very quickly to the durability of the European Union and new stresses within the European Union. Can you give each other 45 seconds only, wondering whether protectionism and this protectionist instinct in the current environment is really going to even challenge the durability and the glue that holds together the European Union? 45 seconds, Mats.
I don't think this is protectionism it's sort of in the form of economic protectionism. I'm not sure that is a bigger threat to the EU than say the Eurozone crisis was. I think that is a significantly bigger sort of threat, if you want to call it that, to the European project. So I think the biggest threat to the EU now is actually more from I guess you can call protectionism, but around sort of sovereignty, maybe one of my second driver of the 5 drivers of protectionism. So more the sovereignty aspect, particularly in some of the new member states that joined since 2004, and how that will play out. I think that is the single biggest threat to the European, that is the biggest single tension, I will say, within the European project, not economic protectionism.
All right, David, do you mind if I just move on, Matt?
Yeah,
David.
please do.
Yeah, I'm here, but my camera's been taken over, so I'm not sure what happened there. So I think there's always a lot of talk in the UK press on the UK not making it and the EU not making it and falling apart. I don't see that. In the political drive for the EU is there to stay. I think as we come to the close, one thing for this audience of members of Swedish chambers is Sweden is also one of those countries which is always been pro-free trade and anti-protectionism. And actually, one of the lessons from this discussion and previous is that voice continues to need to be heard to make the case for open economies and not protectionism.
James, quickly, 30 seconds, please.
I would echo David's thoughts there. That this is an ongoing battle, and if free traders like myself were to lose the battle, the EU would turn itself to be more protectionist, and that would be bad for the EU. Obviously, it would be bad for the UK as well, but I think most importantly, bad for the EU, and that's something we want to go forward. So,
is it a risk?
I think it's certainly a risk. Absolutely, if the EU stagnates and doesn't do well economically, and has big renewed eurozone type crises, protectionism is very definitely a risk in that downside scenario.
All right, James, David, Matt, thank you very much indeed. Just before I hand back to Peter, if I may, Peter, if I may say, I haven't got an enormous study at home. I'm actually in Milan, and I happen to be sitting at the Transport Museum in the dining area of the largest Italian liner which we have ever sailed the Atlantic. Don't ask me why I'm here, but that's why I'm in a rather large and echoey place. So over to you, Peter.
Sure, whatever you say, Nick. I bet that's your living room. But well, first of all, I have to say, I thought we were going to produce the one golden ticket, the one-stop solution to all the trade wars and uncertainty in the global system. You all failed. But jokes aside, thanks for a great conversation. We will continue this at the Swedish-British Summit in December. I hope you all join us then. I know, Nick, you will be. Thanks for our fantastic speakers, David, James, and Mats, and not the least our wonderful host, Nick Gowing. Thanks to our sponsor, Handelsbanken, our partners Thinking the Unthinkable, and the partnering chambers across Europe. And finally, thanks to all of you anonymous or with names, for joining us and asking good questions throughout this morning.
And we answered all 9 of them, Peter.
Sorry?
We answered all 9 of the questions.
Super, good stuff. The next Emerging Stronger event will be in January, and we will be talking about the world in 2022. Until then, take care and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.